Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Atty. Vlogger, Law for the Everyday Layman. Today we take up part 6 on the law of contracts and we continue with the defective contracts. Our topic for today are the unenforceable contracts. Okay? So if you like my videos and you want to see more, please hit the subscribe button. Please remember that this is only for educational purposes and is not a substitute for proper legal advice or for studying and understanding the law. Okay? So what are unenforceable contracts? No? These contracts are valid. Okay? Because all essential elements for their validity are present. We have consent, object, and cause. However, these contracts cannot be enforced, cannot be given effect, or cannot be sued upon in court until and unless they are ratified. Okay? For a deeper discussion on ratification, please refer to my video on voidable contracts, link in the description below. Okay? Now, let's go to the first kind of unenforceable contracts, which are the unauthorized contracts, or those contracts which are entered into in the name of another without the authority, legal representation, or by someone who has acted beyond the scope of the powers granted to him. Okay? So the governing law in case of unauthorized contracts would be Article 1317 of the Civil Code, as well as the laws on agency. By a contract of agency, a person binds himself to render some service or to do something in representation or on behalf of another with the consent or authority of the latter. Okay? So in other words, for an agent to bind the principal, he must first be clothed with authority and power by the principal, and the agent must act within the scope of the authority granted to him. Okay, if the agent acts outside the scope or without legal authority, then he cannot bind his principal. Okay, and the contract is now unenforceable. Okay, but if the agent acts within the scope and he is granted the express power to act on behalf of the principal, then knowledge of the agent is also knowledge of the principal, because the agent is merely an extension of the personality of the principal. For a deeper discussion on agency, please refer to my episode on SPA and the briefer on agency in the link in description below. Okay? So, the unauthorized contract simply follows the principle that a person cannot be bound by a contract entered into by a third person without his knowledge or his consent. Because the rule, if you remember, is that contracts are only binding upon the parties to the agreement as well as their successors in interests, assigns, and heirs. Okay? Okay, so that's it for unauthorized contracts. We can now move on to the second kind of unenforceable contract, which would fall under the Statute of Frauds. The Statute of Frauds is found under paragraph 2 of Article 1403 of the Civil Code. Okay? Now, generally, contracts don't have to be in writing in order to be enforceable. If you remember my discussion on the form of contracts, Article 1356 of the Civil Code says that contracts are obligatory in whatever form they may be entered into, provided all requisites for validity, consent, object, and cause are present. Okay? And if you remember, form is only required by law either for validity, enforceability, or greater convenience. And if the law requires a certain form for validity or for enforceability, that requirement is absolute. Okay? So our topic today is enforceability. Remember, if the law requires a certain form for validity or enforceability, the topic today, then that requirement is absolute. Failure to observe the required form will render the contract unenforceable. Okay? And that is the purpose of the Statute of Frauds, no? Namely, to prevent fraud and guard against the mistakes of honest men by requiring certain agreements to be in writing. Now, the writing can be a note, a memorandum, or any slip of paper as long as there is evidence of a writing. This is based on the principle that the memory of man is frail and faulty. Okay? I'm sure you cannot remember all the things you did when you were 3 years old. So the memory of man is necessarily frail and faulty, and evidence must be relied upon to prove an agreement in the case of the Statute of Frauds. Okay? Now, I mentioned evidence. This is important because the Statute of Frauds is really a rule on evidence. Okay? And as a rule on evidence, this applies only to executory contracts, or those contracts which have not yet been performed at all. Okay? Why? Because if they have been either partially performed or if they have been fully performed or consummated, then the Statute of Frauds will not apply. Why? Because in the case of partial performance or consummated contracts, there is now evidence to show the intention of the parties or of the contract itself. Okay? Now, as a rule on evidence, the Statute of Frauds is personal, meaning it is a defense that may only be invoked by one of the parties to the agreement. It cannot be raised by a third person who has nothing to do or no interest in the contract. Okay? Likewise, the Statute of Frauds is also waivable. It may be waived. Okay? It is a matter of defense. And the effect of waiver is ratification. Okay? So, in other words, if the defense of Statute of Frauds is waived by failure to object to the evidence to prove the contract. Okay? And the result is the contract will now be binding. Okay, so let's give, I'll help you understand it more by giving a concrete example. Let's say Vegeta and Goku entered into an oral contract, okay? And now, Goku did not perform his part. Vegeta now goes to court to try to prove that oral contract, okay? But how can he prove an oral contract, okay? Now, let's say that oral contract is also covered under the Statute of Frauds. Goku, if he does not want to be bound by the contract, will raise as a defense the Statute of Frauds. Okay? He will now say, hey, I am not bound by that contract. You cannot enforce your rights and your rights under the contract and the obligations against me because it is not in writing. And the Statute of Frauds requires that that contract must be in writing for it to be enforced in court. Okay? That's how you use the Statute of Frauds. But as to the waiver, it is by failure to object to evidence. Now, let's say Vegeta is able to produce evidence of the contract, of that oral contract. Okay? Now, Goku failed to say that, hey, it's not in writing, or hey, I am invoking the Statute of Frauds. Then he has impliedly ratified the existence of the contract, okay, by failure to object to the evidence proving the contract. Okay, so in that case, Goku and Vegeta are now both bound under the contract. Okay, so that's the first form of ratification. Ratification can also happen in case there is acceptance of benefits under the contract. Okay? Because this is based upon the principle that one who has received benefits under the contract is not allowed to repudiate that burden. Okay? He cannot simply say, no, no, I do not want to fulfill my obligations. He cannot say that because he has already received the benefits, no? Okay? So, the following now are the situations where the Statute of Frauds does not apply. Okay? First, if the action that, let's say, Vegeta files, no? If the action he files is not for violation of the contract or for specific performance, then the Statute of Frauds does not apply. Okay? Second instance when the statute of frauds does not apply, if the contract is admitted either expressly or impliedly by failure to deny the existence of the contract, then the statute of frauds will not apply. And finally, the statute of frauds does not apply in case the writing does not express the true agreement of the parties. Why? Because the statute of frauds cannot be used as a shield or as a means to commit fraud. Okay? So those are the three instances in which the statute of frauds will not apply. Okay? Now, what is the remedy in case the contract is not in writing? No? First of all, the contract must be valid, and second of all, the contract must be enforceable either by partial performance or if it's fully consummated. Okay, or it does not fall under the statute of frauds. The remedy in the cases which comply with those three requisites I mentioned, no, would be to invoke Article 1357 of the Civil Code and compel the other party to observe the form required by law. Okay? Okay, now we can finally go to the contracts or agreements which fall under the statute of frauds. Okay? This list is exclusive, meaning the statute of frauds can only apply to these enumerated agreements. Okay? First, we have an obligation or an agreement not to be performed within a year from the making of the contract. No, one example is if there is an agreement to build a house by the following year. Okay? Like let's say Vegeta asks Goku to build his house 1 year from the time that they entered into the contract. Okay? Second, a special promise to answer for the death, default, or miscarriage of another. This is more commonly known as a guarantee, okay? Or other similar contracts. For a deeper understanding of guarantee, please watch my episode on guarantee and suretyship, link in the description below. Okay? Next agreement under the statute of frauds. Okay? If the one that is made in consideration of marriage other than a mutual promise to marry. Okay? So let's get this straight first. X agrees to marry Y. That's not what is contemplated. Huh? Okay? Not the agreement to marry each other. Not that. What is contemplated would be either marriage settlement, no? Or the prenuptial agreements, no? Or what if the father of X promises to build a house for X and Y if X and Y gets married? That's made in consideration of marriage, because build a house if X marries Y, no? So the consideration there is if X marries Y. In that case, it is a promise made in consideration of marriage and will fall under the statute of frauds. Okay? Next, we have a sale of chattel, goods, or things in action, no? Which has a price not less than 500 pesos. Okay? And the law also says that an entry in an auctioneer's sales entry book is a valid memorandum, okay, that can be admitted as evidence, no? But assuming you enter in a sale over certain goods whose price is not less than 500 pesos, then it has to be covered by a writing in order for you to enforce it in court. Just remember, the contract is still valid, okay? Your only problem now under enforceable contracts would be enforcing them or proving them under the law. And you will have no problem enforcing them or proving them in court if there has been partial performance or if the contract has already been fully performed, okay? So again, statute of frauds is merely a rule on evidence. Next agreement, no, under the statute of frauds, we have lease for a period of longer than 1 year or a sale of a real property or interest therein. Okay? Now, if it's an oral agreement, that is still valid. Okay? The problem again is enforcing it in court. And there will be no problem enforcing that sale of land if there has been partial performance. Okay? Let's say a person has received part of the price, or the buyer is already in possession of the property. That's already partially or even possibly fully performed, no? And the contract may now be proved. What cannot be proved, what cannot be enforced under enforceable contracts are those executory contracts. Okay? Finally, we have a representation as to the credit of a third person. Okay? So, that's it for the agreements under the Statute of Frauds, and we go to the final and third kind of unenforceable contract, or those where both parties are incapable of giving consent. So again, for a deeper discussion on incapacity or lack of capacity to act, please refer to my video on voidable contracts. No, there's a long discussion there. Okay, now the rule is the parent, guardian, or even that incapacitated person, in case he is a minor when he reaches legal age, may ratify this unenforceable contract. Okay? Now, in case that parent, guardian, or even the minor who has reached legal age ratifies the contract, if it's only on part of one of the parties, then the contract is no longer unenforceable. It becomes voidable. Remember, just one of the parties ratifies. No? Now, if both of the parties ratify, the contract is now validated. Okay? And the validity of the contract now retroacts to the date when the contract was executed. Okay? So that's it for unenforceable contracts. Just remember the three kinds: the unauthorized contracts, those that fall under the Statute of Frauds, and those where both parties are incapable of giving consent. Okay? So I hope you have picked up a thing or two, and I hope to see you again in my next episode. See you. Bye.